have a look at that freezing weather with Jack Scott.
Well, we now know that it's Rennie Powell that we've got to blame for this wintry weather, and the wintry weather, of course, is going to continue.
There's no point in declaring a state of emergency. We've had, I think, 6 states of emergency in the last few years.
We've always had a sense of humour, and heaven knows we've needed it lately.
For many Britons, these are hard times. 17 years ago, Harold Macmillan won an election on the slogan, "You've never had it so good." But the easy affluence that made such a claim possible has long since disappeared. For many ordinary people, it's now an uphill struggle to balance the family budget.
It's cold in London. In the year 1978, the Empire of Britain teeters after years of poor economic policy and union strikes, as one of the coldest winters of the 20th century takes place. With a cold snap on the night of December 30th, and a blizzard engulfing most of the country, exacerbating the poor economic state of the UK by putting higher demands on an already striking public service force. In London, Ford workers go on strike in response to a 5% pay raise proposal. In Liverpool, the gravediggers go on strike, and a warehouse begins to fill up with coffins. On January 22, 1979, in London, the sanitation workers, known as dustmen, also go on strike. This winter season will come to be known as the Winter of Discontent.
In London, untreated rubbish accumulates. The dangers of disease are evident. But the threat of disease is not the only danger. A more immediate hazard, with refuse piling up like some kind of conveyor belt gone mad, is the threat of fire. A grave situation to which nobody can turn a blind eye. Few places in London seem too sacred for the overspill of waste. Leicester Square, haven of tourists and happier times, has more than its fair share. In desperation, the government appeals to the Trade Union Congress to control all strikes. But the TUC also seems powerless. And still it comes, the waste of a city. Thousands of tons of it.
In the beginning of the 1970s, Britain saw an immense spike in inflation rate, topping out in 1975 at 24%, diving the economy of Britain deep into trouble. The then Home Secretary, James Callaghan, had only 7 years before helped stop, in place of strife, a proposed act that would help limit some of the power of worker unions by restricting the union's ability to strike. In 1976, James Callaghan succeeds Harold Wilson as Prime Minister. In an effort to bring down inflation, Wilson had enacted the social contract with the Trades Union Congress, which had them agree to lobby for pay raises for the union workers that were set by the government and not themselves. Now Callaghan holds the trade unions to their promise and attempts to implement a 5% pay raise in 1978, which is overwhelmingly rejected and scoffed as unachievable by the Trade Union Congress. Prime Minister James Callaghan is taking a gamble that imposing the 5% rule would continue to de-escalate inflation lower than its current 10%, and attempts to enforce the rule with the trade unions. With an election fast approaching, as Prime Minister, since his party, the Labour Party, is the majority seat holder for the House of Commons, he has the authority to set the actual date of the general election to within a 5-year span from the last general election.
It's not that we're not prosperous, but that we're not growing as fast as other countries are growing. And that, I think, is the real
weakness of our economy at the present time, our lack of being able to increase our productive capacity as fast as other countries have done.
There are 1.5 million unemployed. There are no forecasts that suggest that that figure will go down in any vast appreciable manner. Are we now to accept that a figure of unemployment of 1 million or 1.5 million is just the standard in Britain, and that's the acceptable standard for as long as we can see ahead?
Well, I think the answer to that must be no. Of course we can't accept any of that, and indeed the job of our government will be to make job. For instance, I've spent a certain amount of time going to Washington, going to Bonn, going to Bremen, because our economies are now so interdependent.
You have been well employed, Prime Minister, but there are still 1.5 million unemployed.
We really mustn't assume that the government, by turning some tap, can get either our government or the German government or the French government or any of the other governments who are suffering from this problem can get people back to work. But we have a job to try and do so.
Now, you presumably would not now see a situation in which a trade union movement would in any way refuse to accept the verdict of the people of this country if they elected a Conservative government.
I'm sure the trade union movement would accept the verdict with very great regret. You see, I brought them in very closely to government. People tell me, well, some of these editorials write and say I'm governed by the trade unions. I don't think they think so. Certainly, I don't think so. But I brought them very closely into cooperation. Trade union leaders can only go as far as their members will allow them. I have always tried to avoid putting trade union leaders into the position, haven't always succeeded, but try to avoid putting trade union leaders into the position where they lose the confidence of their members. That's why I'm not asking them for an agreement this year.
But you understand?
We've got to take... No, hold me about...
I beg your pardon.
We've got to take the responsibility.
He defers until the following year, hoping that his policies will continue to fight inflation and stabilize the United Kingdom economy. On December 30th, the snow strikes and the winter of discontent begins.
Atmosphere of some election fever in the media and in Parliament. Is there going to be an October election?
I don't know. I haven't addressed my mind to it, and I don't propose to do so until after I've had a summer holiday.
Can I seek to address your mind a little bit and suggest to you that the...
Well, you could seek to, but you won't succeed.
That the options are running out on you, that you...
oh, well, there's only a year left, I agree.
But you also... the Liberals have set a deadline on their support for you. Do you really believe that you can carry on much beyond October?
I'll have to take all these factors into account, won't I? I appreciate your reminding me of them.
On January 10th, Callahan returns from a summit in Guadalupe. He stops and talks to the press at the airport after departing his flight.
Twice during the last week, but we've stepped back from it. There's no point in declaring a state of emergency. We've had, I think, 6 states of emergency in the last few years. State of emergency means that the government intends to keep the essential life of the community going, and of course that is our first responsibility, and we shall do so. As you may know, plans for that are always ready. Those contingency plans, when we could see troubles looming ahead, were made before Christmas, so that there was nothing except, of course, putting touches to them, and you've always got to add to your preparations. There was nothing new or exciting that we had to do in that field.
What have your reaction to the criticism that you shouldn't have been away from the country during these past 4 or 5 days?
I'm sure everybody would have liked to have been with me, but I don't think anybody except a few journalists are very jealous of it. I think that they feel that we've been working hard, as indeed we have. And you know, I actually swam, and I know that's the most exciting thing of the visit. But no, I think you should put all that kind of criticism in perspective, and one mustn't allow jealousy to dissuade you from doing what you know is the best thing.
What is your general approach and view of the mounting chaos in the country at the moment?
Well, that's a judgment that you are making. I promise you that if you look at it from outside, and perhaps you're taking a rather parochial view at the moment, I don't think that other people in the world would share the view that there is mounting chaos. You know, we've had strikes before, we've come close to the brink before. There's need for a great deal of industrial self-discipline in this country. I hope we shall gradually learn it, and that we shall avoid hurting each other. But please don't run down your country by talking about mounting chaos.
Does the government's pay policy stand firm, Prime Minister?
I don't think I want to discuss pay policy just at this moment, but you can take it that I have not wavered one iota from my views about what is the best way for this country to proceed in order to keep employment up and in order to make sure that inflation doesn't rise. And whatever happens on the industrial front can't change that view. That stands. We shall have to continue to follow it up. Now, don't you think that's sufficient after an 11, 9-hour flight overnight?
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And no breakfast? However, with the mounting chaos that he talks about in the country, I doubt if I should even find a cup of coffee, do you? Thank you very much.
It is a complete disaster. On January 22nd, the dustmen of London become the latest to strike, and local government begins using parks for storing garbage. The garbage fills Leicester Square and lines some of the streets of London. The workers strike for almost a month, till February 21st. Then they are given an 11% raise, an extra £1 a week, and the possibility of additional pay raises. Margaret Thatcher is the current leader of the Conservative Party and is openly running for Prime Minister in 1979. On March 26th, Thatcher and the Conservative Party put a motion of no confidence in Her Majesty's government, and 2 days later, the government loses the motion by a single vote. With the vote passing, Callaghan now has his hand forced.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, whatever view the Prime Minister may take about the situation in Britain, the opposition took the view that we were in a position of grave trouble of crisis proportions. And I should have thought that that was no longer in doubt, and it was of such a nature and such a proportion that it would also be of great concern to the House, and that we should debate it at the earliest opportunity. The Prime Minister took a different view, and after a month's recess was not prepared to provide a day from government time, so we provided a supply day of our own. The transport reports, the Freight Transport Association, which represents own-account operators like supermarkets, officially they're not in dispute according to the agreement with the TGWU, and they should be exempt from picketing. They report that own-account vehicles are being widely picketed. They also report that basic food supplies are being stopped. The Road Haulage Association confirms that picketing is affecting the supplies of essential goods. The Freight Transport Association also reports a new problem, shortage of diesel fuel, particularly in the southwest because of picketing at the oil terminals at Avonmouth. British Rail report quite simply there are no trains today. And British Transport Docks, the nationalised ports sector, say that on average traffic at their ports is down 40%. Practically no containers are getting in and out of Southampton. The rail strike has added to the burden. The report from CBI, many firms are being strangled, there's a shortage of materials, they can't move their own products, exports are being lost. They say that secondary picketing of firms not in dispute, is very heavy all over the country. There's particularly of things like salt, packaging, sugar, and all vital materials necessary if industry is to keep going. Layoffs known to CBI, at least 125,000 already, expected to be 1 million by the end of the week. There are telegrams and telexes in from many companies saying that their exports are not being allowed through and that they might lose the orders forever. And messages from firms like Marks and Spencer's, last week they lost 20% of their food production, approximately £2 million. Unless secondary pickets are removed this week, we estimate 30% off production. In the last week and this week, unless there's a change, we shall not shift 50% of our exports. The food industry in particular is shambolic. There's pressure on edible oils, on yeast, on salt, on sugar, on packaging. No maize came through Tilbury yesterday. Associated Biscuits have already laid off 1,500 in Huyton, 400 in Southampton, and more by the weekend. Cold stores are laying off people, and all large oil mills in Hull were picketed yesterday, except the one visited by BBC television. Now, what is our approach to this grievous strike situation? Unlike the Prime Minister, we do not go round supporting strikes when we're in opposition. The Prime Minister obviously expects the opposition not to follow his example, and indeed we shall not do so. We shall act responsibly, and he is very fortunate that we shall do. Now, the Prime Minister's answer to all our troubles is a statistic, X%, this year to be 5%. But we cannot have rigid pay policies forever. That is not a possible way of conducting affairs in a free country, in a country which has a great deal much varied industry, in a country which must have its industry changing, always keeping abreast of the times, steadily one step ahead of competitors if we are to survive. It is not a possible way. The real problem we face today is we've lived through quite a long period now of increasing trade union power. That period, I think, has been characterized by a series of what I would call package deals between governments and unions, in which governments have been offered certain advantages in return for certain cooperation. The trouble has been that the advantages tend to have been permanent and enshrined in legislation, and the cooperation only temporary. Added to this, during that time, a time of mounting power to the trade unions, it's also been a period when we've had increasing left-wing militancy in control of the unions. So just at the time when we had, oh yes we have, and the country knows it. The country knows it, the right honourable gentleman, the member for Huyton knows it. The Prime Minister knows it, and the people who are there in the unions, in the rank and file of the unions, know it too.
The right honourable lady understand that she must be in a debate of this importance, specific to the dispute at issue, much more so than apparently she wishes to do, and that the characteristic of this dispute is that the rank and file have been balloting all the way through the piece, and it is only now that the leadership of the Transport and General Workers Union has come in to make it official and take a hand in it. That is the realities of the situation, and her arguments are pure fantasy.
The honourable gentleman suffers from the fact that I understand him perfectly. He knows as well as I do that perhaps one of the reasons why this strike was made official was because it was already out of control. Already out of control because of the mounting left-wing structure of that union. We've been through a period when we've had increasing trade union power. They've had unique power, and unique power requires unique responsibility. That responsibility has not been forthcoming, and therefore we are in the position in which this country finds itself today, about which there can be, in fact, no dispute. In question. The government was warned if they passed that section, it would lead to blacking, blockade and boycott. They were warned about it, that's what they wanted, and that's what we've got.
The Honourable Lady refers to the law as it was in 1972. Is she not aware of the picketing that took place at the Saltley Coke Depot, led by Arthur Scargill, which may have been illegal, but which worked from the union point of view, and the law...
The order. The Right Honourable Lady give way to the Honourable Gentleman. He's making a brief intervention.
And despite what laws are on the statute book or what is written on a piece of paper, it does not guarantee that it will prevent picketing.
The honourable member made one of the most revealing and significant interventions I've ever heard in this House. He's not concerned with legality. He's not concerned with protecting the rights of the ordinary citizen to go about his business in this country. He's concerned with the convenience of the trade union. Now, we don't always judge the Prime Minister by what he says because he does very different things. Most of us didn't like what was happening at Grunwick, but he in fact didn't stop two of his cabinet ministers going on that picket line, or a number of honourable members. And that was a question of numbers, and numbers themselves can be intimidating. Leaving aside the violence altogether, numbers themselves can be intimidating, and his right honourable friend, the member for Hitchin, and his right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Defence, went on those picket lines. They were not concerned in the dispute in any way. And will the Right Honourable Lady also tell the House, as a number of her colleagues have not done in letters to the press, that on the moment there was any violence on the Grunwick picket line, which was many weeks after I went there, I immediately denounced it publicly. The Right Honourable Lady was not concerned in that dispute. She was not in dispute with anyone, as far as I know. Nevertheless, she added her presence to the picket line to the numbers, and numbers themselves can be intimidating. If he will agree to take action on these, then we will support him through and through. We believe that this is a matter of great significance for democracy and a free society, and we will support him if he'll take steps to deal with them, and I hope that he will set them in hand soon. May I point out that this is a more generous offer than he ever gave to us when we were in government. I hope that he will take it, and if he doesn't, that he'll step aside for a party that will.
And he sets the date for the general election for April 2nd.
Yesterday was a very exciting day in the House of Commons. Nobody knew what the result was going to be, and at the end of the day, the government was defeated by a single vote. Well, one is enough, one's a majority, and therefore today I've asked Her Majesty the Queen to dissolve this Parliament, and she has agreed to do so. A general election for a new Parliament will therefore now be held, and it will take place on Thursday, 3rd of May, 5 weeks from today. I dare say you know the government over which I've presided hasn't had a clear majority in the House of Commons at any time. Indeed, there hasn't been a similar period for 50 years. The Labour government has governed against considerable odds, rarely being absolutely certain whether the proposals we thought were necessary would be acceptable to enough of the other parties to give us a majority, and sometimes quite important decisions were overturned. But we went on, because Britain's been passing through the most difficult worldwide crisis of inflation and of unemployment for 40 years. Now, I shall ask the nation to set itself an ambitious objective, to cut price rises in half, to cut them to less than 5% in 3 years from now. We've more than halved inflation during the last 3 years, and we can do it again, and we shall all be better off if we do.
Yes, technically this is a party political broadcast on behalf of the Conservative Party. But tonight I don't propose to use the time to make party political points. I don't think you'd want me to do so. The crisis that our country faces is too serious for that. And it is our country, the whole nation, that faces this crisis, not just one party or even one government. This is no time to put party before country. I start from there. Of course, there are major political differences between the parties, just as there are between many of you sitting at home. But I believe there are some things which should not divide us. None of us wants to see our country torn apart. So here we are, just 2 weeks into 1979, with some of our towns and cities, especially in the North and Midlands, looking as though they're under siege, with many people, the old and those with young children, suffering real hardship, some even without water, while export orders are locked in and food rots at the docks. There are two main issues. First, the role of trade unions in a free society. Successive governments over the last 10 or 15 years have come back to this time and time again. And again their attempts to strike a fair balance with trade union power have been defeated. We've been unable to establish sufficient common ground in Parliament to carry through a programme of reform which the whole country wants and the whole trade union movement can accept. I recognise how hard this is for the Labour Party because of their close connection with the unions. Without the unions, there'd be no Labour Party, and without union money, there'd be no Labour funds. First, we should amend the law on picketing. We should get rid of so-called secondary picketing. That is, picketing which hits firms that aren't directly involved in a dispute. And the government should see that the law is enforced. Then we should agree with the trade union movement a strict code of practice for peaceful picketing. That too must be upheld. One reason why picketing is so powerful is because of the weapon of the closed shop. We must amend that law. Second, we should work out together proposals for making the trade unions more democratic and more representative of their members. Mr. Callaghan's expressed cautious interest in this in the past, but only if the unions approached him. I don't think we can wait for them to do that. If the present crisis has taught us anything, it surely taught us that we have to think of others as well as ourselves. That no one, however strong his case, is entitled to pursue it by hurting others. There are wreckers among us who don't believe this. But the vast majority of us, and that includes the vast majority of trade unionists, do believe it, whether we call ourselves Labour, Conservative, Liberal, or simply British. It's to that majority that I'm talking this evening. We have to learn again to be one nation, or one day we shall be no nation. If we've learned that lesson from these first dark days of 1979, then we've learned something of value. Good night.
And all the other questions have been argued and debated in the papers, on radio and on television. There's only one that really matters in the end. What's best for Britain? I've never believed that this country is a naturally socialist country. We're an independent people. We don't take easily to having more and more of our lives decided for us by the state. We don't take kindly to being pushed around. We're good neighbours, concerned for the welfare of others. We regard it as a privilege to say to the old, the sick, the needy and the disabled, "Don't worry, we'll look after you." Somewhere ahead lies greatness for our country again. This I know in my heart. Look at Britain today, and you may think that an impossible dream. But there's another Britain, which may not make the daily news, but which each one of us knows. It's a Britain of thoughtful people, oh, tantalizingly slow to act, yet marvelously determined when they do. It's their voice which steadies each generation, not by oratory or argument, but by a word here or there, a sudden flash of truth, which makes men pause and think and say, "That makes sense to me." Today, if you listen, you can hear that voice again. It calls not for upheaval or conflict or division. It calls for balance, for a land where all may grow, but none may grow oppressive. Its message is quiet, but insistent. It says this:
Let us make this a country safe to work in. Let us make this a country safe to walk in. Let us make it a country safe to grow up in. Let us make it a country safe to grow old in. And it says, above all, may this land of ours, which we love so much, find dignity and greatness and peace again.
Crisis? What crisis? 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 Crisis? What crisis?
Did you or did you not want better schooling for your children?
Guilty.
Now, did you or did you not want to buy your own home?
Guilty.
Did you or did you not make a profit last year?
Guilty. We'll try not to do it again.
Right. You're sentenced to nationalization. That should put an end to it. I put it to you that you, a pensioner, expected to pay less tax on your savings just because you've spent 45 years working for them.
Guilty.
Is it not true that simply because you spent a few years training for a skilled job, you expected to earn more?
Guilty.
Is it not a fact that you failed to buy your weekend joint yet again because you claim they're too expensive?
Guilty.
But I understand that you and your family had a holiday this year.
The Labour philosophy taxes ambition,
Guilty.
enthusiasm,
Guilty.
achievement.
Guilty.
The very things that create wealth, the things that made Britain great. We all know, in the last 5 years, the living standards of people in this country just have not grown the way they could. The Labour government's explanation for this is that Britain has been suffering because the whole world has been suffering. Well, the fact is that the world did have a bit of a cold, but it seems to be getting over the worst of it. In Britain, that cold seems to have turned into double pneumonia. Look at France. Between 1974 and 1978, the average French worker saw his wages, in terms of what they would buy, go up by 60%. In Germany, the average worker saw his real wages go up by over 92%. The average Italian worker saw his real wages go up by over 47%. Meanwhile, in Britain, the average industrial worker has seen his real wages, in terms of what they will buy, only go up by 16%. And it isn't just the French, Germans, and Italians who've done better. The British worker has also done worse than, for example, workers in Denmark, Belgium, Canada. It's not that they don't care about the unemployed. They do. And it's not that they don't mean well for our health service or our old people. Of course they do. The Labour Party has always expressed the best intentions in these areas. But it's no good having good intentions if you can't afford to carry them out. You can't pay for better social services with good intentions. Caring that works costs cash. It all seems to come down to one thing: money, and the policies which create it. Labour never seem to have enough. Strange, you might think, when we're paying more tax under this present Labour government than ever before. But despite all this tax they're collecting, they still haven't got enough to pay for the proper standards of social services. And they never can get enough coming in from tax when people aren't earning enough in the first place. So the Labour government has to take more and more of what we do earn to try and pay for the schools, hospitals and social services we all want.
We've always had a sense of humour, and heaven knows we've needed it lately. But we've other characteristics too, a gift for invention, for initiative and for hard work. Under Labour, these talents are going to waste, because the government takes too much away in tax. How often do you hear people say, look how much they've taken from my pay packet? So naturally they ask for bigger pay rises to make up the difference. And it's not long before that pushes up prices. Ask any housewife, she'll tell you. This government has increased prices more and faster than any other government since records were kept. The only way to keep prices down is to get production up. And you don't do that by weighing people down with taxes and other restrictions. They don't work for the chance of the exchequer. They work for their families. So we've got to cut the tax on earnings and the tax on skill. Give our people incentives. And once again, Britain will be back in the race.
Don't just hope for a better life. Vote for one.
On May 5th, 1979, just a few months after the Winter of Discontent, Margaret Thatcher is elected as the Prime Minister of the UK.
Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
Good news, everyone! I got in a fight with the garbage men and they're cutting off our service.